Christianity is actually it's the progenitor of a lot of these things that we just assume within modern society. And one of the things he highlights is consent. Consent is a Christian ethic in the sense of, if you look at ancient cultures, whether
Like
that's
sexual consent?
yeah, the idea that this should be consensual, like I mentioned before,
Right.
you know, the whole idea of there not being a natural way to say a male virgin, but 25 ways to say a female prostitute. Like that was the Roman ideal. And that was just normative, and it was seen as just the neutral position. Whereas Christianity always looked at that and saying, like, those women have value and purpose and meaning. They bear the image of God. And so they need to be both protected and valued and seen as equals.
What about Judaism, which wasn't, you know, the Holy Roman Empire? They had their own sect as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this ethic sits at the heart of what Judaism should be, but things definitely go awry. We don't always do this well. And that's what Jesus, a lot of the time, criticizes, is the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. A lot of it is about this, where he says, you have heard it said, but I say. And so he looks at the law, and it sounds like he's correcting the law, but that's not what he's doing. He's actually going back to the intention of what the law meant. So when he says, you have heard it said, do not kill your brother, but I tell you, anybody who has hatred in his heart for his brother has committed murder. He's not saying that, you know, if you hate your friend, that you're actually committing murder, but he's getting to the heart of the issue of what the law actually meant. Like the purpose of the intention of these things communicate ethics and values before they actually communicate prescriptions of how things should actually be. And part of the problem was that you had these sects, S-E-C-T-S, not S-E-X, that I mentioned before, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were hyper-religious. And Jesus looks at them and he says, hey, you're tithing your like mint leaves. That's stupid. That's missing the point of what tithing is about. Like stop going so into the specifics of the law where you're actually missing the forest for the trees. And part of that, I think, is this development which we see within Judaism, which is a negative patriarchal aspect. I mean, I don't think that patriarchy is necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but there's a negative aspect of patriarchy in the same way that if you look at the content of Christianity and you pour it out, you get things like love your neighbor as yourself, pray for those who persecute you. But Christianity has a long history of not doing that well. There's another great book by a guy named John Dickson, who is an Australian New Testament scholar. He wrote a book called Bullies and Saints. And he goes through a lot of these examples of where he points out, okay, things like public education, that was a Christian institution. Things like universities, Christian institution. Public healthcare, Christian institutions. But then he says, you know, Jesus says, make sure you take the log out of your eye before you start pointing at the speck in your brother's eye. Let's look at the logs in our eye. Let's look at some of these examples of where Christianity has really done a terrible job at articulating and living by its essence.
When you say those are Christian institutions, is it literally they're started by Christians on the basis of their Christian faith, or they're started by people who happen to be Christians and therefore they're Christian institutions? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, if you look at their motivations for why they're doing what they're doing, a lot of it has to do with, like, the education factor was we want people to be able to read the Bible. Like a lot of the origins of public education come out of individuals like John Knox in Scotland, who was like, hey, I'm a Protestant. We're translating the Bible into English. I want people to know what it is. And the interesting thing I mentioned to you earlier before the show, Tom Holland, the historian, not the actor who is Spider-Man. I always have to preface with that. In his book Dominion, has a big section on slavery and says there is no abolition movement anywhere in history that was not both a Christian one and was motivated specifically by Christians. Why? Because they said, we see the fact that we're all created in the image of God. And in fact, one of the first abolitionist movements was in the 4th century by the Cappadocian Fathers. And what they did is I think it was Gregory Nazianzus, preaches this sermon where he says, how dare you think you can pay a price for God's image? You can't do that because there is no image on There is no price that could actually pay for how valuable the image of God is in every individual. And so they're the first ancient abolitionist movements. And then you also have Augustine, who's raiding these slave ships. Him and his church members are going in and raiding the slave ships and releasing them. And he writes and he says, I don't know if this is right to do, like ethically go in and like literally clear out these slave ships because this is to detriment of these people who this is their job. But at the same time, I can't help but do this.
Yeah.
And so you have these institutions which are not just motivated, but even the abolitionist movement in both England and then later in the United States, they were all Christians. None of them were not Christians. And even when the abolitionists, and there's a great section in Tom Holland's Dominion where he talks about how a number of the British abolitionists went down into North Africa to try to convince some of the sultans within North Africa to get on board, and they laughed at them. They laughed at them, and actually one of the lines, I think it was in Libya, the Sultan of Libya, said the only institution that goes back to Adam is slavery.